Howdy boys, and welcome to Mr. East Classroom. In today's episode we're going to be talking about the Founding Fathers. Who are the Founding Fathers? Well, Founding Fathers is a title we use for a relatively large group of men who all played various and different leading roles in the cause of American independence, and who were pivotal figures in the early days of the American Republic, and who played key parts in sort of forming its early institutions and documents of government. In this picture, for instance, there's a lot of people that you should recognize or might recognize. We have George Washington, who's standing there at the table. We have Benjamin Franklin center stage. We have Alexander Hamilton, and a bunch of other people who you may not recognize. You probably, or good chance you don't recognize some of those I named. But this is a painting or a representation of the signing of the American Constitution in 1787, I believe. And I chose this image just to represent some of the people who you probably associate with the grouping, the Founding Fathers. In today's video, we're going to be looking at 6 gentlemen in particular who all played different parts in the cause of American independence and the formation of early American government. They're all going to come from different areas of the country, but as you'll see, there's 2 sort of key groupings of regions that they come from. And really what I want to do today is just introduce this sort of cast of characters so that when we go into the central events of the American founding, you'll understand who some of these key people are. We're not going to talk about every event in their life, just sort of do a quick profile of them so you understand who they are. So the first man on our list is also the oldest man on the list, at least with regard to whenever the American Revolution is kicking off, and that's Benjamin Franklin. You almost certainly recognize it from the $100 bill. By the time of the events we're looking at today, the American Revolution and then the beginning of the American government, Benjamin Franklin is an old man. He's already well known, but he's kind of past his prime, although some of his most important work is yet to be done. Benjamin Franklin, just key biographical stuff, was born in Boston, Massachusetts, but as a young man, around 17, he actually flees Boston. He's in a work contract under his older brother that he's not much of a fan of. He's going to flee south to Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, where he's going to start a new life as a young fugitive. Now, you've probably heard many different things about Benjamin Franklin, what he's done. And the funny thing about those stories is that they're probably all more or less true. Benjamin Franklin really did a lot in his life. He was kind of the original American Renaissance man. Eventually he's going to be a polymath. He's very well educated in all sorts of sciences and the modern intellectual scene of his day. In all that regard, he's pretty much self-taught, as a couple of the gentlemen we look at today will be. But Benjamin Franklin is really going to build a name and international reputation for himself before any of the events of independence take place. So he's going to start his career as a newspaper man and a printer, and really he's going to revolutionize the newspaper scene in America and become very good and prominent at it, but also be a publisher generally. So you've probably heard of Poor Richard's Almanac, which was a farmer's almanac with a bunch of interesting material in it besides just sort of calendars and seasons and weather. And that sort of was his bread and butter early on, how he rose to at least financial prominence. But among many of his other achievements, he was an inventor. And you probably heard of him discovering electricity, and in some way this is true. He invented the lightning rod. Among other inventions, he made the glass harmonica and a stove called the Franklin stove. But as a general rule, he never patented any of his inventions. He wanted them to be sort of free to use. And throughout sort of the 1750s, moving into the 1760s, he will be regarded as sort of a public intellectual, a kind of wise man. He will travel abroad quite a lot. He'll go to Britain, where he's well received. And as we'll see in later events, he actually goes to France, which is probably what he's most famous for during the Revolution. But Franklin was a member of the Continental Congress, as we discussed in class, and he's going to actually be a pretty early advocate of a strong, independent American position toward Britain. He was one of the first people back in the 1760s to sort of recommend that the colonists form some kind of union or collective organization. So if anyone's really thinking of the potential idea of a united America early on, is Benjamin Franklin. And he's going to be at the writing and signing of the Declaration of Independence. So, as most of us know, Thomas Jefferson wrote the bulk of the Declaration of Independence, but Benjamin Franklin was on the committee of 5 people who helped drafted the document, and he was kind of old and ill at the time, so he didn't write most of it, but he did have some key edits. During the Revolutionary War, he's going to be America's ambassador in France, which, as we'll see when we talk about the war, will be a very important position. He kind of cultivates an image of a sort of simplistic, simple living American and a sort of quiet, wise man while in France, which is really sort of assumed personality. That's not how he had been earlier. But so he'll be important in sort of cultivating the image of what Americans are like abroad into the French. And what he'll help do is secure French support in the war later on. He's not the only person key to that process, but he was sort of the ambassador on the scene for it. And whenever the Constitution is eventually written and drafted, he will be there. And for the rest of his life, he will be important in Pennsylvania state politics as well. He'll be a governor there before he's dead. But generally, you know, he's going to be a snapshot of the best parts, or at least the most interesting parts of American social life before independence, and throughout the whole process he's sort of a fierce patriot. He will not, however, ever be president, unlike many other people who are on our currency. The next person to discuss is John Adams, who I've selected to go next because he was from Boston. He's a lifelong Bostonian. Unlike Franklin, he never leaves Boston, or at least not permanently for residence. So John Adams is going to be a successful lawyer in Boston, kind of a self-made man. He didn't start wealthy. Franklin didn't start wealthy either. And he will rise to prominence in the law scene in Boston. One of the first big sort of famous things he's a part of is he defends the British soldiers who participated in the Boston Massacre. He defends them successfully. While this gains him a rough name among patriots at the time, Adams is actually largely sympathetic to the patriot cause at this time. He will be a very strong legalistic critic of Britain. He's going to argue that what they're doing towards the Americans is unconstitutional, and he's going to use legal arguments against them. His brother, Samuel Adams, is a leader of the Sons of Liberty and will actually be key in calling the First Continental Congress. And young John Adams will get sent along as a Massachusetts representative to that Congress. In that whole event, he will emerge as kind of a deal maker between the radicals and the sort of conservatives of the early patriots. And he will also be on the Committee of 5 with Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, who draft the Declaration of Independence. He's going to emerge as kind of an alter ego of Thomas Jefferson as time goes on. Not an alter ego, but a sort of opponent. Sometimes friendly, sometimes not friendly. But so his input was important on the decision for independence, and he's going to be the representative of Massachusetts at that time. During the war, much like Benjamin Franklin, his importance will be as an ambassador to Britain and to France at times. He hops around quite a bit, and he'll be an ambassador for much of the rest of his career. Some of his early writings were important in shaping the U.S. Constitution, but he was not at the Constitutional Convention. He will be our first vice president serving under President Washington, and he will be our second president. And we'll talk about the events of his presidency later on, but that's John Adams. Now, if you've heard of no one else out of these founding fathers, you've definitely heard of George Washington. He's a guy we've looked at and covered a bit already in class, but we'll quickly look over his accomplishments. So Washington comes from a Virginia planter family, and as we've already noted, he started his career as a land surveyor and was a commander in the French and Indian War. After the war, he will rise to prominence as a successful Virginia plantation owner with his wife Martha, who actually helps him get a lot of his land. And he's going to be a very early critic of Britain. So Washington's one of the guys who is angered by the 1763 proclamation line. And after that, he really has a sour relationship with Great Britain. He'll be involved in Virginia politics, so he's actually a member of the House of Burgesses. And whenever the Continental Congress is called and formed, George Washington is going to be there. So during his life and in practice, he was regarded as sort of a quiet man who chose his words carefully. Sometimes that's earned him a reputation for being sort of simple-minded and not much of a thinker. That's not accurate. Washington was very much a thinker and a thoughtful man whose thoughts would be important in the early formation of American government. But he did choose his words very carefully. That was a skill he learned. Basically a policy of only speak when you can decide the question. Something we can all learn from. And Washington is actually going to get selected by the Continental Congress to be the commander-in-chief of the Patriot forces, eventually of the Continental Army. Commander of basically the American forces in the Revolutionary War. He's going to serve that post for the entirety of the war. What's important about Washington, and we'll hit this in class, is that his popularity, he's probably the most famous American during the Revolutionary War, and his name was going to be the most universally recognized across the 13 colonies and eventually the 13 states. And what's important about Washington is that at the height of his power as general, when the war was over, he gave up his commission and he went back home to farm in Virginia, a plantation with slaves, but gave up the military power that he held. And that earned him a lot of goodwill amongst the American people, so he will be our first president and be very important in steering how American government, setting a lot of the norms and standards of American government when that all gets started with the Constitution. It is generally accepted that Washington's leadership and sort of moral authority were important with keeping the American states together after the end of the war. And as a final note, whenever he passes away, after he doesn't live very long, after maybe like a year or so, after leaving the White House, or the president's mansion at the time, not the White House, he will that his slaves are freed whenever, both upon his death and then the death of his wife Martha sometime later. I just note that because that was not a normal behavior of Virginia planters at the time, and it kind of illustrates some of Washington's moral thinking and development over his lifetime. The next founder is Thomas Jefferson, a man, again, you've probably heard of before. Like Washington, he comes from a Virginia planter background. He's going to own a large plantation, which is Monticello, if you've ever seen it. He's going to be a man, he's younger than Washington, a man who's good with words, good with ideas, but ultimately a complicated figure. So he's not going to be a soldier, but he will participate in early sort of Virginia. He'll be a critic of Britain early on, and then he'll get elected to the Continental Congress, where he will serve a very important role, and that is that he's going to be the chief author of the Declaration of Independence. Much of the flowery language of liberty, or inspirational language of liberty and human rights and those sorts of things, or at least the rights of men, are going to be written out by Thomas Jefferson. He will take input from people like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, but Jefferson's the guy who really carries that document. After that, however, he goes off to Virginia, and that's where he spends the rest of the war. He's going to be governor of Virginia, where he leads state politics, and we won't really see him play a central political role again until after the war. He will be important in sort of beginning what will later be called the Jeffersonian tradition, or the kind of democratic tradition in American political thought. His ideas are going to be very important when we get to the Constitution, and then the political scene after the Constitution is ratified. He is going to be a critic of centralizing government, at least at the national level. He will advocate a separation of church and state. He will be relatively in favor of the common man, although I don't want to exaggerate that point. If anyone at this time is pro-democracy, it's going to be Thomas Jefferson, but people aren't very pro-democracy. Again, not everyone's voting at this time, as we talked about in class. But his next real key roles, he'll play key roles in the administration of George Washington as Secretary of State, set some precedents there. But after the Declaration of Independence, his next key sort of influence is in his term, or his 2 terms as president. He'll be our 3rd president after winning the election of 1800. We'll get to him, but those are his key contributions, just a quick profile. Our next founder is James Madison, who I've called the man behind the scenes. That's because if you haven't heard of any of these founders, you probably haven't heard of James Madison, even though his role in forming early American government is extremely important. He was another Virginia planter, so he's going to complete sort of our Virginia mafia of founding fathers. His career early on is going to be kind of quiet. You won't see him at most of the big events, but he's going to be a congressman from Virginia. He's actually very important in setting a lot of the early standards of Congress under the Confederation. And so he'll be important there as a congressman and legislator. But he's going to be very important in forming and writing the U.S. Constitution. He's called the father of the Constitution because of the central role he played in drafting it. That reputation has been contested over time, but that's the general idea I want you to know about him for now. He'll also be important in getting the Constitution ratified. Later, he'll be a Secretary of State, and he'll play another big role as 4th President of the United States. In this way, his career kind of mirrors Thomas Jefferson's a lot. He's important with a Central American document, then he'll kind of disappear into the political scene, and then re-emerge as a president. His personality will be very different from Jefferson's, but you get the idea. The last founder we're talking about today is also the youngest, and that's Alexander Hamilton, who I've called the Nationalist here, and we'll kind of see why that is. Now, if most people have heard much about Alexander Hamilton today, and it wasn't in a U.S. history course, it's probably because of the musical Hamilton. We're just going to put that to one side. I don't really want to use the musical for any kind of historical information. It sometimes obscures more than it helps anything. But some key facts about Alexander Hamilton. He's different than a lot of the people we've talked about, especially the Virginians. Hamilton will actually be born in the British Caribbean, so he's the only one of the founding fathers we're looking at today who is not born in the continental United States. He'll immigrate as a young man of about 17 to New York. Hamilton's actually going to be very poor when he gets here. He was born to a mistress of his father, so not even a legitimate son. And he's going to have to work at the docks to put himself through college. He'll end up going to college in New York, where he becomes sort of an early proponent of the Patriot cause during the British controversies over taxation. And whenever college is closed during the war, he'll actually join the army and become sort of a very successful soldier. It's in the military that he really makes his early career. After doing well in battle and being a good soldier, a faithful servant, Washington will actually select him to be one of his direct aides, where he will become a close friend of George Washington. Obviously, that's going to help his political career down the road. After the war, he will become a congressman from New York and a lawyer. He's very good at both. And he'll be one of the key people, along with James Madison, who gets the ball rolling to draft a constitution. We'll talk about that when we talk about the Articles of Confederation and all that business. But he's very important to the constitutional process. He will be important in sort of leading the Federalists in getting the Constitution ratified. And afterwards, he'll kind of be a key political player who will build the second tradition, not the Jeffersonian tradition, but the Hamiltonian one. Hamilton, as a general rule, is going to be in favor of centralized national government. He wants to build strong national institutions, whereas we'd mentioned Jefferson is more about decentralized institutions. So he's going to want a strong state, and part of that plan is building up the nation's economy and its financial institutions. And he's actually going to be in George Washington's cabinet as the Secretary of the Treasury, where he will set up a lot of important early financial institutions that we'll talk about in detail later. And finally, you may already know this, but Hamilton actually meets an early end because he gets in a duel with Aaron Burr, who is another New York politician. And Aaron Burr is going to end up shooting Hamilton. It's kind of an early tragedy. He died in his 40s, and we really don't know what Hamilton might have been able to do with his life following that. But for now, that'll pretty much wrap up our discussion of the founders. There are, of course, many other founders. We briefly mentioned John Dickinson in class, for instance. But I don't expect you to know many of the others, and knowing these guys will give you a good idea of some of the key players and the processes we're about to talk about in depth.